Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we all know that Arctic ecosystems are experiencing dramatic and rapid changes because of the effects of climate warming. One example of this is polar cod, which is a species that's eaten by seals, narwhal, and halibut. And cod are particularly vulnerable to climate warming because their larvae have a very narrow thermal tolerance. So if the water is too cold, below about -2 degrees, the larvae die. If it's too warm, above about 5 degrees, they'll also die. And Carolyn Bouchard from the Nature Institute she studies cod larvae. And last year, one of the warmest on Greenland's records, she was analysing some of her data and fully expecting to see poor survival of cod larvae in the very warm waters of West Greenland. So imagine her surprise when in one of her samples she discovered cod larvae swimming alive and well in water where the sea surface temperature was 10 degrees. Now, I'm not going to tell you the rest of that story. If you want to find out more, you can talk to Caroline at the Nature Institute or read some of her research. But the point of starting on that story was to hopefully demonstrate the power of telling science as a story. Hopefully you're left wondering, how did that happen? What's going on there? And the reason why hopefully you're thinking that is because of the way that I gave you the information as a story or as a narrative, which is just simply a fancier way of telling you, of saying that it's a story. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to give a bit more detail about using stories to engage communities with science. And the community that you might be trying to reach might be a local community where you're doing your research, but that might also include, for example, students or young people. It might include local councils or authorities. It might include politicians. There are lots of possibilities of who your target audience might be. But particularly, I'm thinking about communicating science to non-scientists. And there might also be a lot of reasons why you want to do that. You might be looking for permission to work in a certain area or to use a certain data set. You might be wanting to develop trust with the local community in a project that's ongoing. You might want input from your audience to find out whether the methods you're using are appropriate. You might want to benefit from the knowledge that they have. You might want them to be actively involved in your research to provide you with information. You might want to share the results of your research, whether it's ongoing or whether it's finished, so that your results can actually be used by the community. You might be looking for more funding, or you might simply be required to tell the community about your science because it's a requirement of your funding. But whatever the reason is, if you are telling your science as a story, it's likely to be one of the most effective ways of communicating your science. So now I'm going to talk about what is a narrative, why are stories so effective, and what other tools can you use to engage your audience with your story. So first of all, what's a narrative? Well, there are various different definitions of what a narrative is, but it's basically a way of structuring your information so it's communicated as a story. And it needs these things. It needs a setting, it needs characters, it needs a narrator, it needs to have a series of events that are told in some kind of time sequence, and it needs a narrative structure. Okay, what's the narrative structure? A narrative structure has 4 basic elements, and they need to be told in this order. First of all, you need a background or a setting. You need to tell your audience who the story involves, where it's set, give them some basic information on where you're starting from. The next thing is you need to give them a trigger or a hook. And what I mean here is that you're introducing a problem or a conflict that draws your reader or your listener into the story and makes them wonder, how is this going to be resolved? Then you have some actions, something happens in the story to address that problem. And finally, there's a resolution of some kind. The problem is resolved one way or another. And usually the resolution gives some kind of overall meaning to the whole story. So here's an example. It's not a science example, we'll come to that, but it's probably one that you all know. It's one of Aesop's fables, The Goose That Laid the Golden Eggs. So, a man and his wife had the good fortune to own a goose that laid a golden egg every day. Lucky though they were, they soon began to think they weren't getting rich fast enough, and imagining that the bird must be made of gold inside, they decided to kill it to secure the whole store of precious metal all at once. But when they cut it open, they found it's just like any other goose. So they neither got rich all at once, as they had hoped, nor did they now get the daily addition to their wealth. The reason I really like this example is that there are 4 sentences in this example, and each one is one of the fundamental components of a narrative structure. First of all, in the first sentence, we're introduced to the characters, the man, his wife, and the goose that lays the eggs. In the second sentence, the trigger is introduced. We learn that they're thinking, oh, we could get really rich, let's cut it open and see what happens. And we're thinking, hang on, this sounds like a bad idea. So there's a conflict here. In the third sentence, they actually do it. Here's the action. They cut the goose open and they discover, oh, right, it's just a goose. And finally, there's a resolution. We get the meaning of the story. They neither get rich at once, nor do they now get their golden egg every day. So those are the basics of a narrative structure. Okay, but how does that apply to science? Well, if you think about it, if you think about the scientific method, it actually fits very closely to a narrative structure. So first of all, you've got some data and observations. This is your background information, your setting, if you like. And then you introduce a trigger. So you come up with a hypothesis to explain the data, or you recognize a problem that needs to be resolved. So this is your trigger or hook, the problem that needs to be solved. Then there's some kind of action. You collect more data, you analyze the data to address that problem. And finally, you come up with some conclusions, so you resolve the story. So usually science can actually be fitted into a narrative structure fairly easily. And if I go back to Caroline's example at the start of Polar Cod, then what I gave you, you can probably see, were the first 2 elements of narrative structure. I gave you the background. We've got Polar Cod that are a key species. They're particularly vulnerable at their larval stage to temperature changes. And then I gave you the hook. She had this one sample where the larvae were alive in water that was too warm. What's going on? Okay, so this is the kind of framework to fit your science into. All right, fine, but why? Why don't we just give people information and there you go, they've got the information. Well, studies of storytelling are quite compelling in showing that stories are very effective at communicating with and engaging audiences. Multiple studies show that stories are more engaging, they're more enjoyable, they're more memorable, they're more persuasive, and they're more fully and quickly comprehended or understood than other styles of communication. And the reasons why storytelling is so effective is because of the effect that they have on people. And this includes things like mental simulation. That simply means becoming lost in a story, as no doubt you all have become at some point reading a good book. Suddenly that's your world. People become empathetically connected with the narrator or characters, and as soon as people feel emotions, they become very engaged with the story. And particularly for stories that are told verbally, listeners will often anticipate what's going to happen next, and anticipation has been correlated with understanding. But more than all that, researchers have actually argued that the fundamental nature of how humans understand the world around us is through stories. In other words, storytelling is it's not just another style of communication, it's actually hardwired into our brain. It's how we experience the world. So by telling your science as stories, you're giving the information to people in a way that is most natural for them to understand. What else can you do? What other tools can you use to increase audience engagement with your story? Well, there are lots of things you can do. But first of all, and crucially, you need to understand who your audience is. What do they care about? What about the research you're doing is relevant to them? Does it affect their lives? Does it affect their children? Does it affect their future, their values? Are they going to feel emotional about it? And you need to shape the information you're giving to them around what's relevant to them and what's interesting to them, not what's interesting to you. One of the things you need to think about is, what do they already know? And the reason for doing that is because all humans learn by starting with the information they already have. We construct our knowledge on the basis of the knowledge we already have. So by starting from a point where you give information that is already known, you're allowing people to connect with the information you're giving. If you don't know what they already know, then you need to find out. You also need to go where your audience is, as the last talk demonstrated quite nicely. So sadly, you can't expect people to be interested in your science just because you think it's interesting. They're not going to actively seek it out. Most people won't go to your organisation's website to find out what you've been up to. So you need to take the information and put it in the place where people are already reading or already listening. So that could be physically showing up in their community and talking to them directly. It could be seeking out an interview on KNR if you know that your audience is listening to the radio. It could be posting on relevant Facebook groups. So you need to know where your audience is and then take the information there and put it in a format that they're used to and that they want. Another useful method is to find a local champion. And by that I mean someone who is well known and trusted within the audience that you're trying to reach. So it might be a school teacher, it could be a local business person, it could be the mayor, somebody who has the general respect of the community or the audience that you want to reach. A person like this is hopefully someone who can help engage you with your audience. So get people to show up to the event that you're hosting. Introduce you to people who are going to be useful for you to know. Someone who can tell you about what is important to the community that you want to reach and what's relevant to them. So finding a person like this can be really useful place to start planning how to reach your audience. Okay, so seeing this is about stories, I thought I'd better finish by telling a story. So I'm a geologist, and some years ago I worked making geological maps of the tropical north of Australia for the Northern Territory government. And in the Northern Territory, most of the land is Aboriginal land. It's managed and owned by the traditional Indigenous owners. And these people are many small groups who speak different languages and have different traditions and who generally live on their ancestral land. And in order for us to go out and make the maps that we want to make, we need their permission to work on their land and to do the kind of work that we want to do. So to get that permission during the wet season, which is around about this time of year in Australia, when it pours with rain every day, and when it's impossible to go out and actually do field work because of the intense heat and humidity, and because most of the land is completely flooded, so you can't physically drive anywhere, we instead spent some of our time going out to meet traditional owners to tell them about the work we were planning for the following year and to get permission to do that work. So with the roads flooded, the only way to get out to these meetings was by light aircraft. So I remember sitting on the airstrip in Darwin, 10 of us in this tiny little twin propeller plane, no fresh air. The pilot came on the intercom and apologised, saying that the air conditioning would come on when he switched the engines on in a few minutes. And meanwhile, we're pouring with sweat in 40-degree heat and 100% humidity. But finally, we taxied down the runway and we're all recovering in the air conditioning. And once we're up in the air, I was looking out at this beautiful drowned emerald green landscape below us. And then we arrived in this small community called Owen Pele. After about 35 years of living mostly in Australia, this was my very first experience of an Aboriginal community. In fact, I'd never even met an Aboriginal person until this day. So a very new environment for me. I was ushered into this public meeting hall where I should give a presentation, and there were a dozen or so traditional owners sitting there to listen to what I wanted to say. And I gave a simple PowerPoint presentation, told them about where we wanted to work and the map we wanted to make, and how we wanted to understand how the rocks were formed and so on. And everyone sat there and watched, and they were attentive, and they gave no indication of what they thought though. And when I finished, the meeting facilitator said, "Okay, are there any questions?" And there were no questions. And I was ushered out of the room and nothing happened. That was it. So I kept coming back and doing this again and again. I gave the same presentation with the same results, nothing. But at about the fourth meeting, an archaeologist who was also there for a different reason, he'd heard my talk before and he talked to me a bit about what we wanted to do. And he intervened. So after my talk, he introduced me to one of the local elders, and he said to this old man, "What these guys want to do is like what you're interested in. You both want to understand the story of your land." He said to this old man, "You understand it from your stories and your history, but these geologists, they want to understand the stories of the rocks and their history." And the old man didn't say anything, but he just nodded. And then at the next meeting I came to, I gave the same talk. I was expecting the same result. But as I spoke, I noticed that everyone in the room was smiling this time. And they started whispering to each other and they were nodding. And I was thinking, what's going on? And it was like an invisible switch had flicked. And at the end of the presentation, they all continued smiling and nodding, and I walked out of the room. And then one of the traditional owners who'd been there, he approached me and he asked me to tell me more about it. And no one had ever approached me before, let alone speak to me. And he shook my hand and he gave us permission on behalf of the community to go ahead with the map. So a successful story in the end. And back then I didn't know very much about science communication, and I'm quite sure I didn't tell a very good story. But now I can see some of the reasons why finally I was successful. One of those reasons is that I went to the audience. I kept coming back and telling the same story and developing some level of trust. I happened to stumble across a local champion, somebody they already knew and trusted, who was willing to provide me with some credibility. So he also spoke to this elder, starting from a point that was meaningful to him, by talking about what we wanted to do in terms of the importance that they placed on the stories of their land. And then obviously this guy had gone off and talked to everybody else in the community before my next presentation. So I'm going to wrap up there, but I just wanted to say finally that although it's sometimes seen that way, communicating science is not an add-on at the end of a project, a burden that some people see it is to communicate information back to a community. It's actually a process that can really enhance your experience of the science that you're doing, your experience of everything around the science, but potentially also the quality of the science itself. Thank you. There's a few references.